Hello, and thank you for joining me for this Reliability 201 Vulnerability and Configuration Change Management presentation. Before we get started, I want to highlight our policy against antitrust violations. Please take a moment or two and read and absorb this information. Should you have any questions, please bring them to Texas RE's General Counsel. So vulnerability and configuration change management typically relates to the standard CIP 10-4, particularly requirements 1, 2, and 3. The purpose of the standard is to prevent and detect unauthorized changes to BES cyber systems by specifying configuration change management and vulnerability assessment requirements in support of protecting BES cyber systems from compromise that could lead to misoperation or instability of the bulk electric system. So let's get started with baselines or configuration change management. The purpose of this is to understand what your normal is on your system. Because if you understand what your normal is, and anything changes that was unauthorized, it could raise a warning flag to a compromise to your system. So what is your baseline supposed to look like? That's going to be addressed in Requirement 1, Part 1.1, which is to develop a baseline configuration individually or by group, which shall include the following items. First, operating systems, including the version or firmware where no independent operating system exists. For firmware, you could think of that like your RTU, which does not typically have an operating system and would be firmware only. In that case, you would just document the firmware version that is on that RTU. Second, you have any commercially available or open source application software, including the version intentionally installed. Thirdly, any custom software installed. Now, this could be something that you contract out to a vendor to have them develop, or something that you develop in-house. In either case, that would be custom software, and it would be applicable for 1.1.3. Next, you'll have any logical network accessible ports, and this relates quite a bit to CIP 7, particularly Requirement 1, Part 1.1, where they require you to document any open logical network accessible ports, including the justification for those open ports. And then finally, any security patches applied. Note that it's only security patches that need to be documented as part of that, and not any additional patches to software that aren't security related. For this requirement, it's applicable to high and medium impact BES cyber systems and their associated electronic access control and monitoring systems, or EACMS, your physical access control systems, or PACs, and your protected cyber assets, or PCAs. We're going to be using these terms quite a bit throughout this presentation, so from now on, I'm just going to simply refer to them as EACMS, PACs, and PCAs. Now, I do want to hesitate before we move on and talk about what developing a baseline configuration individually and developing that baseline configuration by group looks like. So if you're going to develop that baseline configuration individually, typically what we see is that it's for a standalone server, it's doing a very specific task, and you don't really have any other cyber assets that perform that same task or have any of the following items for this part exactly the same, in which case you would develop that baseline configuration individually. If you were going to develop a baseline configuration by group, let's say you have a whole bunch of operator workstations. Those cyber assets typically look exactly the same, and all of these items should be exactly the same amongst those workstations. In which case, you could develop that baseline configuration by group with the understanding that these items must be exactly the same across all cyber assets. And it makes it much easier to do the rest of the parts as part of the standard. Which here we are getting into the rest of them. So this is what needs to be done prior to a change to the baseline. So for this slide and the next slide, I have configured this in such a way that shows the timeline of events that need to happen. The way that these parts are laid out in the standard isn't necessarily in chronological order, and that's going to make a little bit more sense on the next slide. But for this slide, prior to any changes to the baseline, you must do the following for the associated applicable assets. First up, we have 1.2, which applies to high and medium impact BES cyber systems and their associated ECMs, PACs, and PCAs. For this, you must authorize and document changes that deviate from the existing baseline configuration. I do want to note very quickly that as a best practice, the authorizer and the requester from any changes to the baseline generally should be separate people. Next up, and with the same applicability, we have 1.4.1, which is to determine required cybersecurity controls in CIP5 and CIP7 that could be impacted by the change. Now, the cybersecurity controls in CIP5 and CIP7 are somewhat up to you to determine yourselves. However, we will get into a little bit later some of the specific items that you should be looking for as part of these requirements. Additionally, just as another bit of best practice, it's good to document exactly how you are going to verify or determine the required cybersecurity controls that could be impacted by having a more detailed process rather than just having a checklist of items that you would go through. Next up, for 1.5, this relates to high-impact BES cyber systems only. And for the first part, where technically feasible, you must test changes to ensure that required cybersecurity controls in CIP5 and CIP7 are not adversely affected. So those same cybersecurity controls that we talked about in 1.4, you must test those changes first. Now, you can either use a test environment or a production environment to test these changes. But if you're going to use a test environment, then it must be similar to your production environment. And if you're going to use your production environment, you must minimize any adverse effects to that environment that could occur. And as the second part to this, you must document the results of that testing. If a testing environment was used, you must document the differences between the test and the production environments, and include a description of the measures used to account for any differences in operation. And finally, we get to 1.6, and this applies to high and medium impact BES cyber systems and their associated ECMs and PACs. Note that it does not apply to protected cyber assets or PCAs. So prior to a change to the baseline that deviates from the baseline items identified in parts 1.1.1, 1.1.2, and 1.1.5 that we talked about earlier, and when you are able, you must verify the identity of the software source and verify the integrity of the software obtained from the software source. Now, 1.6 is very similar to CIP13, which deals with supply chain management, and is actually the reason why this standard is part of the CMEP IP this year. 1.6 does not require you to renegotiate any contracts with the software source or vendors that you might have, but we do ask that you do your best to verify the identity and verify the integrity to the best of your extent. So now we get into post-change to the baseline. So this is going to be after the changes are made, what you need to do. For all three of these parts, it's applicable to high and medium impact BES cyber systems and their associated ECMs, PACs, and PCAs. For this first part here, 1.4.2, following the change, which is 1.4.1, verify that required cybersecurity controls determined in 1.4.1 were not adversely affected. And then for 1.4.3, you will document the results of that verification. And then finally, and again, not in chronological order, we are stepping back a bit from 1.4 to 1.3. At the very end, you will update the baseline configuration as necessary within 30 calendar days of completing the change. So in roughly a month, you will, after you have made that change to the system, you will need to document that change within your baseline configuration. So now we do have an example of a change ticket. These are things that you can implement within your own change ticket management system or however else you have this done. But these are just some items that we have seen applied in the past. So first up, you have the ticket number and the change ticket date. This is just to identify the ticket itself. Throughout this entire example, including the next slide, you are going to see a lot of dates being applied. This is because CIP 10 is a very extensive standard and there's quite a bit of time-based requirements as part of it. So it's good to have those dates included. So next up, you have the approver and the change approval date, a description of the change and the reason for the change. So that'll be like, we applied these security patches and the reason there was a vulnerability for that these security patches mitigated. Next up, we have a backout plan. Now, this is not required by the standard, but it is best practice to include this somewhere, just in case if any updates or security patches that were applied maybe broke something after they were applied or something wonky has happened. You want to be able to quickly repeal those changes so you can return your system to normal. Next up, you have the asset IDs and applicable systems. Again, if you are doing a baseline configuration individually, then those asset IDs you would just list for the specific cyber asset, or you could list it by its group name. Next up, we have the baseline elements impacted. This is good just to know what changes are being made and what particular part they relate to. Then we have the pre-cybersecurity controls for CIP 5 and CIP 7 verified. And here's that list that I was talking about of more specific items that you could include as part of your CIP 5 and CIP 7 cybersecurity controls verification. Again, we would generally advise against having just a strict checklist, though you certainly can, and maybe a more detailed process on how to verify these cybersecurity controls specifically. The next up, we have the production environment used and the test environment used. Now, you don't necessarily have to include these within a change ticket either, especially if you only use one specific test environment or you always use this production environment, in which case you could simply have that documented within your process documentation. Then we have the identity of software source description and the integrity of software obtained description. And part of this is just to document how this was verified. And then finally, you have the change completed date, when those changes were actually applied to the system or systems. And now we have an example of a ticket post change. So what's going to happen after that change has been applied? So first you see here is the post cybersecurity controls for CIP 5 and CIP 7 verified. They're pretty much the exact same thing as listed earlier. And so you would just go off the list and make sure that you have verified that no impact has actually occurred for these cybersecurity controls. And then next you have the baseline configuration updated date. It's good to have this recorded just so you can be sure that it does reside within the 30 calendar days as per the requirements. And then finally, the associated evidence files. Again, this is not required in the standard, but it is good to have a way to relate any extra evidence files. Maybe you have documented the verification for the cybersecurity controls elsewhere. It's good to be able to relate that directly to the change ticket or however you're managing this. That way, when the time comes around, you can easily find this extra evidence. And now we'll get into monitoring for changes. Now, this is going to be for requirement 2 and only applies to high impact BES cyber systems. Because these systems are so critical, the additional layer was applied to monitor for changes to the baseline configuration at least once every 35 calendar days. And then after that, you will document and investigate any detected unauthorized changes. Now, there are some automation tools out there that will kind of do this on an ongoing basis for you. They will go out and they have the baseline configuration already uploaded to their system. They will go out and ping the particular cyber asset and ensure that that asset still has all the same baseline configuration items. They're all the same. And then if anything has changed, it will raise a flag and alert certain personnel. Now let's get into the vulnerability assessments. Now, the purpose of this is really just to fill any gaps in your security posture that weren't really identified as part of the baseline configuration. Maybe something else has changed that, yes, it's part of the baseline configuration, but it's not necessarily best practice as far as security is concerned. So for vulnerability assessments, there are 4 parts to requirement 3. The first one is 3.1, and it applies to high and medium impact BES cyber systems and their associated ECMs, PACs, and PCA. And for this, you must conduct a paper or active vulnerability assessment at least once every 15 calendar months, or just over a year. So there is no specific requirement on what you need to include as part of your vulnerability assessment, but it is generally recommended to include items such as network discovery, network port and service identification, vulnerability review, such as firewall rules, those kinds of things, and a wireless communications review. So as part of this, I want to go into what the difference is between a paper and an active vulnerability assessment. So a paper vulnerability assessment, you're really just looking at the documentation that you already have. For example, network discovery, you'd be looking at your network diagrams, perhaps, or any other documentation that you might have, just to ensure that those assets are residing where they're supposed to reside. In the case of an active vulnerability assessment, those typically use tools such as hardware or software to ensure that your documentation is correct. At that point, you would be looking for maybe some cyber assets that aren't supposed to be on that network, and also ensuring that the assets that are within that network have the right security controls applied. Next up, we have 3.2, which applies for high-impact BES cyber systems only. And similar to 1.5, where able, you will perform an active vulnerability assessment in a test or production environment at least once every 36 calendar months. So again, you can either use a test environment or a production environment. If you're going to use a test environment, it has to be similar to your production environment. And if you're using a production environment, you need to minimize any adverse effects to that environment. And then as the second part to that, you will need to document the results of that testing, and if a test environment was used, the differences between the test and the production environment. And then next we have 3.3, which applies to high-impact BES cyber systems and their associated ECMs and PCA. Note that it does not include medium-impact BES cyber systems or physical access control systems, or PACs. And the standard is, prior to adding a new applicable cyber asset to production, perform an active vulnerability assessment, except under SIP exceptional circumstances, and for cyber assets that model an existing baseline configuration of an existing cyber asset. So as an example, if you were to say, create another operator workstation and it matches all of the baseline items before it goes into production, at that point you wouldn't have to have an active vulnerability assessment because it already models an existing baseline configuration of an existing cyber asset, the other operator workstations. But if you were to implement maybe a new system, put a new server onto your data center, that's very different, does very different things. At that point, you will need to do an active vulnerability assessment. And then finally, we have 3.4, and this is applicable to high and medium impact BES cyber systems and their associated ECMs, PACs, and PCAs. You will need to document the results of the assessments and the action plan created to remediate or mitigate any vulnerabilities identified, including the planned date of completion and the execution status. Now, this requirement does not specify a specific timeline that you have to have this mitigated within, but it is up to you to set that date through that planned date of completion, and at that point you would have to mitigate any vulnerabilities by that planned date of completion. Now, I've gone over both configuration change management and vulnerability assessments, and so now I want to get into the best practices for these. I've stated a little bit over the course of this presentation, but CIP10 is a very complex standard and has quite a bit of heavy lifting associated with it. So all of these best practices go into alleviating some of that burden off of the personnel and being able to prevent any mistakes being made while trying to comply with this standard. First up, we have detailed process documentation. This just helps ensure personnel are able to follow specific steps, prevent any that they might miss something, prevent something falling through the cracks. In this case, the more detailed your process documentation, the less likely it is that somebody's going to miss something. Next up, we have layered internal controls. Now, I specified layered internal controls because if you just have one internal control, there's generally something that's going to be missed, a hole in which something can go through, essentially. And so having an additional internal control behind that could prevent any mistakes being made. For example, there is a lot of time-based requirements as part of the standard. Let's say as you're approaching the 35 calendar day mark to monitor for any changes to the baseline configuration. Maybe 2 weeks before then, you have a calendar notification to a specific personnel member to go in and monitor for those changes. That would be a internal control to make sure that that requirement is being met. As an additional layer to that internal control, maybe that personnel is out sick, something has happened, and they just weren't able to get to it within that 2-week window. Maybe a few days to a week before the requirement that specific date comes by, it sends another notification to either a secondary member or maybe a supervisor just to ensure that that requirement is being met. That would be a layered internal control. And then finally, we have automation. Now, I hesitated a bit adding this to best practices as not every entity can apply automation on their systems. It could be quite costly to some, and in some ways, it just doesn't make sense. However, automation really does alleviate a lot of the burden off of personnel and takes away some of the human error factor that could lead to a potential non-compliance. You could either go out and purchase a automation software or system to do a lot of this for you, or you could also do an in-house automation system that somebody has developed for you. In which case, if you're going to do this in-house automation, an additional layer of scrutiny should be applied just to ensure that it is meeting all the requirements that it needs to. Thank you for attending this presentation. I hope you all have a wonderful day.